Well, I want to thank you all again so much for coming this evening. Again, I'm Randy Braun, and I couldn't be more excited to have a conversation with you all tonight about quieting our inner critic. Before we got started, folks were sharing in the chat what brought them here tonight, and we got some really universal themes around imposter syndrome, feeling like we're enough, wanting to improve our relationships, wanting to have better performance at work while lowering these kind of out of proportion expectations that we have. And so I want to start our conversation tonight with a question that has defined a generation. Raise your hand if you have been personally victimized by Regina George. And now I want to ask you, raise your hand if you have been personally victimized by yourself. And if you have ever told yourself a version of this story, I'm really hard on myself, but that's totally normal. Plus, it's what makes me so successful. I have news for you. You have been personally victimized by yourself and your inner critic. We all have a Regina George inside of us. She might not look like this. It might not sound like this, but our inner critic, she's kind of a mean girl. We think that she holds the key to fitting in, to being a part of the A crowd, to being our best self. And our inner critic, she's tricky because she has strong opinions about what she thinks is good for us, what our inner critic thinks is going to make us successful. And that's being some version of this, if you remember from Mean Girls, a plastic. We think that if we do what the inner critic tells us, we're going to be popular and liked and successful and get ahead. When actually the key to our fulfillment is usually just being ourselves, being authentic, being vulnerable, being curious, being that inner mathlete. And so my inner mathletes, let me just introduce myself and tell you where we're going tonight. For those of you who I don't know, and it's fun to see some friendly faces, I'm Randy Braun. I'm an executive coach and the founder of Something Major, a women's leadership coaching and consulting firm. I don't want to brag, but I have the best job in the entire world. I spend my time with high-performing women, helping them live and lead their lives on purpose, thriving at work and in their businesses, feeling less burnt out, more fulfilled, and more impactful. And I am so thrilled to have this conversation with you all tonight because even though I work with a diverse array of women, there are few things that are as universal as this, as game-changing as learning who your inner critic is and quieting it to unlock your truest potential and your next levels of happiness and fulfillment. And I just want to be really crystal clear about one thing. I have an inner critic too. She is loud and chatty and aggressive. And so if you came here tonight thinking that you were going to hear all the secrets from someone who's living and leading their life on high on some pedestal, you are going to be sorely disappointed. If you did come here tonight to have an honest and open and curious and actionable conversation about self-confidence and self-doubt, fabulous news, you have come to the right place. So let's talk about what we're actually going to talk about tonight. And why I'm so excited to have this conversation is that these are the things that I talk about with my actual clients, the honest to goodness tactics and tools and resources. And I'm so glad and honored that you're here because I've never talked about these tools and resources in this kind of group webinar setting before. So thank you for being a part of the first time where we're bringing this to more of a group conversation. So we're going to talk about what the inner critic actually is. If you signed up tonight, it's probably because this topic resonated with you, but maybe you don't actually know what the inner critic is. And so we're going to talk all about that. We're going to talk specifically about how you can recognize your inner critic. Because until you have the awareness of what your inner critic sounds like, your inner critic thinks, There's not much that you can actually do about it. Thirdly, we're going to really parse out, what is the inner critic versus the voice of reason? Because the number one thing that I hear from women as they start to get warmed up and comfortable and familiar with this content is, this seems like an interesting idea, but I just want to let you know, this isn't my inner critic. This stuff I'm hearing and thinking, this is totally my voice of reason, and we're going to debunk that myth. And then lastly, we're going to talk about some strategies for quieting our inner critic, as well as talking about the stuff that doesn't work so that you don't spin your wheels wasting your time on stuff that isn't going to help you. That is a lot to think about. So let's start with this question. What is the inner critic? Anybody want to unmute or throw in the chat? What do you think the inner critic is?
Randy?
Yeah, Jan.
I think it's probably an echo of things that we've been told, and we're hearing it in our own voice.
That's a part of it. That's a huge part of it, and we're going to talk about that. Nina added, and I think it's very related, our expectations, what we think we can accomplish or what we should accomplish. Definitely, Nina. I would say anything you hear in your head from a place of should is always inner critic, is always other people's expectations. Yeah, comparing ourselves to others, Melissa says, we're going to talk about that. Jessica says our self-doubt. Great news. Everyone's a winner. You're all right. And these are all things that we're going to talk about. The biggest misconception that I hear is that people think that the inner critic and the voice of reason are some like angel devil duo, right? And they're duking it out as these existential forces of good and evil. And that's just not the case, because our inner critic can be mean, it can be hurtful, but it's not inherently evil. It's inherently human. And that's why we need to learn to understand our inner critic and handle it constructively. The inner critic is actually an internal warning sign. All the inner critic cares about is keeping you safe. I'm going to say this one more time. All the inner critic cares about is keeping you safe in its dysfunctional, messed up ways, right? It wants to keep your risk down. It wants to keep your exposure low. It does not want you to take any risks that might result in you embarrassing yourself or failing or being rejected or being vulnerable or getting hurt. And to be crystal clear, right, the critic's all about safety, mitigation, and risk minimization. It cares nothing of your fulfillment, cares nothing of your dreams and your aspirations. It's not that it's bad or mean, it just doesn't care about that. And here's the problem. You know that if you've ever done something big or bold, you probably had to take a risk. You probably had to be vulnerable to some extent. And so the inner critic isn't inherently evil. It can actually be really helpful when we learn to use it. And we're going to talk about that tonight. Where we get into trouble, and I see this all the time, especially in women, high performers, total superstars, is that when we let our inner critic go unchecked, unquestioned, or just let it kind of take the wheel and drive, we are held back. And here's why. Because remember back to Regina George. Just like she told Katie to wear pink on Wednesdays, she thinks, that inner critic thinks that they're going to make us successful. The inner critic, like Regina George, thinks that she's doing you a favor, making you successful, making you look good. And when we listen to our inner critic without question or let it have too much influence in our decision making, all we really end up with is some version of wearing an ill-fitting pink shirt in a mall and losing all of our friends. And I don't know about you, but my friendships are more important than ever in COVID. So I'm not going to end up in an ill-fitting pink shirt in a mall. So let's talk about the 5 telltale signs that you are hearing your inner critic. And I just want to be clear, it doesn't have to check the box on all 5 of these. Some are going to resonate more with you than others. Some are going to resonate on different days in different ways. I just want to give you options. Number 1, what you're hearing or thinking or feeling is mean or judgy, you're going to blow it. You're so fat. You're a horrible friend. You're going to embarrass yourself. This is so simple. Cardinal rule. If you wouldn't say it to somebody else, it's probably your inner critic. That's how we know harsh and judgy. Number 2, it plays on repeat. Our critics are consistent, they're persistent, but they are not creative. They tend to have the same talk track again and again and again, and it just shows up in different places. It's like a playlist of zingers that you cannot turn off. Number 3, it's constantly on in the background as a personal news ticker. And I will tell you, this is my personal inner critic kryptonite, right? It's like that news ticker on the news. You're watching Anderson Cooper interview someone on CNN, and you got the other little news happening in the background, subconsciously, subliminally educating and informing you, right? That can be your inner critic. It's not loud, but it is persistent. Number 4, and Jan hit the nail on the head when she said this before, it parrots people you know. It takes inspiration from messages you heard when you were growing up. It takes inspiration from that horrible loss, that horrible friend, that toxic person in your life. Maybe, depending on how you grew up, from, a clergy member. And I don't say that against organized religion. For those of you who know me, I'm a deeply religious person. But it parrots some of the messages that you heard growing up about what you should do. And then number 5, it gets loud around important high stakes things. And I just want to be clear, this makes total sense, because remember, it's our internal warning sign. And so, of course, if you have a big conversation, a big opportunity, a big negotiation, a big priority, of course it's going to get loud. And so I want to ask you to look in the mirror for a second. And we're going to get to know a little bit about your inner critic. So I want, if you have a pen and paper, I see some of you taking notes, which is awesome. Renee, I see you have a question. We're going to take questions in a few minutes. We're going to go through a little exercise here. If you have a pen and paper, I want you to take a few notes. If you don't have a pen and paper, open up a new OneNote, take some notes on your iPhone, and I'm going to ask you a few questions so that you can get to know a little bit about your inner critic. What are the harsh things your inner critic says? Or what are the harsh things that you hear? So just take a minute, don't overthink it. What are some of the harsh things that you hear or that you say? Number 2, what does your inner critic believe? Does it believe that success is working as many hours as possible? Does it believe that success is perfection? Does it believe that you're too loud, that you shouldn't inconvenience people? What does your inner critic believe? Number 3, who does your inner critic sound like? Who does your inner critic parrot from maybe when you grew up, or a boss, or a colleague, or a bully? How would you describe the critic's temperament? Is your critic anxious, sad, angry, mean, cold? I had one client, and I can say this because this is not a corporate session. I had one client tell me that her critic's a grade A bitch. And you know what? I see a ton of people laughing. That meant something to her. So what is your critic's temperament? Two more questions. When is the time you've heard the inner critic? Maybe this is a time your inner critic showed up today. Maybe you're putting the pieces together and you're like, wow, that time that thing happened in graduate school, my inner critic was there. And then lastly, what does your inner critic look like? Is it a girl, a woman, a man? Is it not really a human form? Is it a cartoon? I see some smiles. For some of you, this question will resonate. For others, it won't. Don't stress. You don't have to answer all 6. I have options here. If you come to a something major event, you know we're all about putting out the buffet, not giving you a prescription. So what does your inner critic look like? And I just want to pause here for a moment. If you're still writing, write. If you're still thinking, think. Anyone brave to share something that they came up with? And I'm just going to read something that Nina wrote in the chat because I thought it was really inspiring, which was she never thought about what her critic could look like from a visibility perspective per question number 6. Nina says that she's also learning her inner critic's she's realizing her inner critic's very loud. Can I get a +1 in the chat if your inner critic is loud? My inner critic is very, very loud. I've learned to quiet it, and that's what we're all about doing tonight. Yeah. Leslie Ann gave me a bunch of pluses. Anyone else want to share something that they came up with, that they discovered? Or maybe you're having trouble with this. And I'm just going to read a few things in the chat as we're waiting. So feel free to use the raise hand function if you want us to unmute or throw it in the chat. And while we're waiting for that, I'm just reading a few things. Kim says, number 2, she believes that she has to be perfect to be valid, say things the right way, to be heard, etc. I'm seeing so many nods here. I think, Kim, you've hit on something that resonates with a lot of people. Avani is saying, believes that I'm so strong, I can endure anything. That definitely resonates. Jennifer says, my inner critic looks like me. I've heard that. I've heard people say that their inner critic looks like some crazy, their words, not mine, fantasy character, right? Everyone's visibility is different. Alexa says, my inner critic is the best version of myself, right? Skinny, successful, and this is the kicker, who I'm convinced I can't become. Jan says it's more of a feeling and a voice than a visual. Jan, you're not alone. Some people, you don't need to ever have a visual to know who your inner critic is. Nikki says, but what if it fails? Jumping right into potential aftermath. And Nikki, we're going to talk about strategies about following our fear to the end game tonight. Wow, I'm so amazed by this. Nina says, don't go to the next step because we don't know what it's going to look like. So there's that fear of moving forward, fear, as Nina continues to write, about control. Sam says that hers withholds as a means of intimidating and manipulating. I'm hearing, you'll make a terrible mistake, an overachiever. And what I'm seeing is that everyone puts something different. And yet, I don't know about you, but I actually saw a lot of common themes. Let me ask you a question. Who just went through this exercise and is thinking even like 1%? But Randy, I'm telling you, it's my voice of reason. Anybody struggling with this at all? Jan says, that's a hard no from Jan. Or has anyone felt this way before? Like your critical thoughts might be your voice of reason, right? Kim is saying her inner critic is useful sometimes. Kim, that's exactly the point, right? Is like, sometimes she is useful. Or I don't know if yours is a woman. I love this question from Nina. Well, if I'm here and I've made it this far, the inner critic must have done something reasonable, right? And so it gets really confusing because sometimes the things that our inner critic drives us to do, prep the heck out of something, to expect every contingency plan, some of those things have made us successful. And so it can be confusing to parse, is this my inner critic or the voice of reason? And I want to share with you some incredible tactics that come from one of my personal teachers, Tara Moore. So if you have read this book, let's talk about it sometime. If you haven't read this book, we're going to send the link out in the follow-up, and you should read it. This comes from one of my teachers, like I said, Tara Moore, and she has this great chart in her book about inner critic versus voice of reason. And so taking a little bit of inspiration from not just Tara's book, but some of the great learning that I've had to do with her, I want to go through a few scenarios about inner critic or voice of reason. And I'm curious if we have a volunteer. Does anybody have perhaps a situation at work or a situation outside of work where you feel like your inner critic is getting chatty, or you're not sure if it's the voice of reason, or you're struggling? Anybody want to be our brave volunteer tonight? I see like some suggestive smiles. It's a very vulnerable thing. So why don't I share with you an example that I hear a lot. And before I do that, Jan and Alexa threw a few things into the chat that I just think are so notable and so evergreen from what I hear every day working with my clients, right? Jan said, when it comes to the inner critic, there is no logic or reasoning, just fear and jealousy. And we're going to talk about that. And Alexa says, she lists all of my past failures. So she collects evidence. And Alexa, we're going to talk about evidence too. So let's imagine you have a big presentation or a big meeting at work. Can I just see a +1? Have you ever in your professional lives conducted a meeting or a session or a conversation that just felt high stakes and important? Okay, yeah, the chat's moving really quickly. Okay, I love this. Like, you hit a nerve when you have to start wondering, are we going to break the chat? Which is great. I would love for us to break the chat. That would be awesome. So let's take this, right? A big presentation at work. Our inner critic tends to make bold declarations. You're going to be a huge failure. This is going to be a mess. You're going to blow it. You're going to embarrass yourself. You're not going to get the client. My boss is going to fire me. Leadership's going to realize I'm over my skis, right? The inner critic makes declarations. Our voice of reason asks curious questions. So the voice of reason, instead of making declarations, might come from a place of, what do I need to do to feel confident about this presentation or meeting? What resources or support can I leverage? Where could I strengthen this? Curious questions live with our voice of reason. Bold declarations live with our inner critic. Our inner critic is also a binary thinker. It's black or white, nothing can exist in the gray. So our inner critic might present an ultimatum. You're either going to be a smashing success or a complete failure. I see some head nods. I saw someone laughing. Yeah. Our voice of reason assesses the options. Okay, this could go well. This might not resonate. Parts of this could go well and parts of this could be a flop. The voice of reason is always looking at all of the options. Voice of reason zooms out to zoom in. Inner critic just zooms in and perseverates, which brings me to this. Our inner critic obsesses over the problems, obsesses. Whereas the voice of reason seeks solutions. So The inner critic might say, oh my God, that graph on slide 17, it's just, I'm not sure that it's right. Whereas the voice of reason might say, who can help me with the data visuals? Who on the team might know how to work a pivot table, right? And collect the information. Now, Nina put something on the chat that was so poignant, which is sometimes we're tempted to ask ourselves, well, the inner critic seems to have gotten me this far. Or like Kim put into our chat, you know, the inner critic can be helpful. And so there's no doubt that the inner critic can be helpful. It's a warning sign. It's an invitation when we hear the inner critic, and we're going to talk about this when we talk about strategies for quieting it. It's an invitation to assess risk. However, if you've been telling yourself a story that your inner critic makes you successful, I just have one question for you. Do you think you could be more successful asking curious questions, assessing the options, and seeking solutions? Or do you think you're going to maximize your success by making declarations, presenting ultimatums, and obsessing over problems? So it's not a matter of can our inner critic make us successful? No, please. I am like a recovering obsessor of the problems. I'm in active recovery, right? I have an inner critic just like you. It's not a matter of will we be successful. It's about maximizing our success and maximizing our fulfillment and our enjoyment along the way. And so I want to hear, feel free to give me a hand raise or throw something into the chat. What questions do you have about the inner critic and recognizing your inner critic and parsing inner critic from voice of reason? And while we're waiting for that, just reading one thing that I left in the chat. Obsessing gets me to a better product, but at what cost? And that is really the $1 million question. At what cost? Anyone have any questions? Kim said, what are the most effective ways to tell her to take a back seat? We're going to go there in just 1 second. And we're going to talk first, Kim, about the things that don't work. And then we're going to talk about the things that do. And just taking a few more questions. Slava asked, is the inner critic the same as the outer critic? I'm not sure if you're referring to specific terms. In my experience, the inner critic can parrot people in our external lives who have been critical of us. So perhaps that's an answer to the question. And Jess says, how do we start to separate the voices? And we're going to talk about that. So that's a perfect segue. I am dying to tell you, and I think you're dying to hear because I'm hearing from the questions in the chat, I'm dying to tell you the things that do work. But I feel like I would be doing you a disservice if we didn't talk a little bit about the things that don't work. Because what I don't want you to do is to spin your wheel making one of these 3 classic mistakes. Classic mistake number 1, we can cheerlead it away. I wish that we could have a pep rally. I wish that we could power pose it away. It's like I tell my clients, I know you've got this, but until you know you've got this, it means nothing. Because telling yourself that you can do it, it might help for a second, but it is not going to bail you out or help you recenter in the middle of a decision, in the middle of a high stakes interaction or meeting. And so you can't simply cheerlead it away. That falls flat often as a hollow platitude. It's not going to make any lasting change. To that end, can I just get a +1 if you have ever leaned on external validation as a crutch for your own self-doubt and self-confidence? I wish I could put like a +1000 in there because again, it's like I am a recovering, just like everyone here. It's like, again, we're going to break the chat. I love it. I am a recovering external validation junkie, and it's counterintuitive, but actually external validation can add fuel to the fire of our inner critic. And here's why. I love this quote. If you live by people's compliments, you will die by their criticism. And so what happens if we are using external validation to tend to and quiet our inner critic, and someone says something that isn't what we wanted to hear? I mean, it's just an invitation to turn up the volume, not down. And then lastly, this is about quieting the inner critic, not muting it. Unfortunately, we cannot simply hit the mute button. And this is so important. I see women all the time. They're like, you know what? I hear my inner critic. I'm going to compartmentalize or sweep it under the rug. And here's the issue. Remember back, our inner critic is a warning mechanism. It's all about keeping us safe. And so it's like the more you ignore it, the more it's going to work overdrive to make sure its warning signals are heard. It's like an alarm. The other night I set off the alarm in my house. It's like the first thing I get is like the beep, 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 come to the keypad siren. And then I get like the like intruders in the premises siren. And then I get a call from the police. And my app wasn't working on my phone. And it's like it just kept warning and warning and escalating. And me saying, turn off, I don't need to hear you right now. Like it didn't do anything. So let's talk about a few things that do work. And this is all paradoxical. We're going to talk about 8 things. And what I mean by being paradoxical is this. Everything I'm going to show you is both immediately actionable and takes practice. You can immediately start to use these tactics, and yet I encourage you to grow attentive to them and to practice them over and over again so that they become a little bit more automatic. 8 ways to quiet your inner critic. Number 1, this is the simplest. Simply getting aware can help quiet the critic's voice. Remember, the inner critic, that siren whirling, all it wants to do is be heard. And so just developing this awareness around, that's my inner critic. It creates a moment to reevaluate your perspective and make an active choice to quiet a little bit or to make a decision in a different direction. Number 2, get curious. So if the inner critic is all about keeping us safe, is all about risk mitigation, I encourage you, when you start to hear a message, right, that ticker tape, that best hits of your zingers, that voice of that person in your past who's parroting in your head, get curious with yourself. And if you've ever coached me, and I know that we have some clients joining and watching the recording, right? I ask you this question all the time. What are you scared of? What is the inner critic trying to protect you from? So just getting curious, what is that inner critic trying to protect you from? Number 3, it's counterintuitive, because our inner critics can be mean and they can be painful. But I want to invite you to start comforting your inner critic. You know, at the end of the day, it's just scared. It's really, really fearful. And so if you can get curious with yourself about, what's my inner critic actually scared of? You can start to comfort the inner critic. What do you need to tell the inner critic to say, you know what? Thank you, but I've got this. You know what? Thank you, but actually I'm going to look at a few different options before I make that declaration that this is how it's going to be. Number 4, and this is one other thing that comes from Tara that I love. My teacher, who, if you're just joining us, we were talking about some of her tactics for voice of reason versus inner critic. Following our fear to the end game, like actually play it out. Worst case scenario. Okay, I'm going to fail in this big thing at work, and then really following that fear to the end game, make a contingency plan for the worst case scenario. I'm going to blow it. I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to lose all my clients, which means I'm not going to be able to pay my rent, which means I'm going to have to be evicted from my apartment, which means I'm going to live on my parents' couch, or I'm going to be couch surfing with friends. Follow your fear to the end game. And Nikki says this has been so helpful for her. It's empowering. Which brings us to number 5, which is greet your inner critic with humor, right? Oftentimes, if you actually follow fear to the end game, it is hilarious Like absolutely, positively, utterly ludicrous. I was talking to a client the other day, superstar, just started a job at a new organization, and she found that her inner critic had her comparing herself as someone in the first decade of her career to the people who head up her department who are staring down retirement, who have decades of experience. And we were like, wait, that's ridiculous. Like, that's hilarious. Imagine yourself at 50. Do you think some 30-year-old is going to be able to know how to do your job? Right? Oftentimes, there are moments of levity and humor. A few more. Envision 3 alternatives, right? I might really embarrass myself at this conversation, or it could go just fine, or it could go great, or this one thing could resonate. Right? Actually write down what a few different alternative scenarios are, or speak them out loud, or talk it out with a friend. You don't need a coach to do that. Grab a girlfriend. Number 7. I told you that you cannot mute your inner critic, but you can bottle it. Sometimes when I'm working with my clients, if we're really stuck and tangled on something that our inner critic is chatty about, I will tell them, grab your pen, grab your notebook, let's write down every single thing your inner critic is telling you. You're not good enough. You're going to fail. Your clients are going to lose trust in you. Your people are going to lose trust in you. Go grab a Tupperware, a baggie, or a mason jar from your kitchen. Let's write up all those little messages, put them inside, and just leave them on your desk, right? And then you can just take what's been inside your head and quiet the voice of the inner critic, because you know it's just living in a bottle, right? All of that's living in a bottle, and now you can progress and move forward. And then finally, if you have a great visual, again, to my point before, Jan said, my inner critic's not really that visible. That's okay. Nina said, I've never thought about my inner critic visibly. This is clicking for me. If you do have a visual for your inner critic, imagine walking them out of the room. Or even, I sometimes have my clients do this, stand up. The other day I had a client stand up in her apartment and push her inner critic out the door. I suggested this to another person, push your inner critic out of the room. And she said, I'm actually sitting in a room with a balcony. Do you mind if I push her over the ledge? I was like, amazing. Whatever is going to create some space for you. And so I want to hear from you, right? Look in that mirror and think about for a moment right now, something you've observed, maybe it's today or recently, where your inner critic is getting really chatty. Just take a moment and just put it in your mind's eye. And now I want you to come back here, and you can throw me a number in the chat. Which of these is something you're curious about trying out, or something you think could be helpful? And Nikki already got us started. She said number 4 earlier is so helpful. And Brittany, can you repeat the question in the chat for everyone, which is, which of these numbers is a tool that you can use to quiet your inner critic? Nina says number 2, number 4, and number 6. Kim says 8 and 3. More 8s and 3s. Some 4s, right? So we're hearing comforting the critic, following our fear to the end game, walking the critic out of the room, bottling the inner critic. Brittany, thanks for throwing that in the chat, right? Getting aware. And you know what I love? Every single number here was mentioned, because there's no right way. There's no one way. I love this. Slava says, getting aware, following fear to the end game, greeting my critic with humor, envisioning the alternatives. I will tell you for myself, number 3 for me is just comforting my inner critic and following my fear to the end game is really, really helpful. But I want to give you 8, and each number was represented here in the chat specifically because every single one of you is a different person. And guess what? Some of these are just going to resonate differently on different days. So I'm going to take this slide off in a second. You will be getting this recording, but if this was helpful for you and you want to do a quick screenshot, now is your warning. And while we're doing that, if anyone wants to kind of like see this live in the moment, does anyone want to share something where their inner critic is chatty and try using one of these techniques in real time? And while we're waiting for that, feel free to raise a hand or pop in the chat. I love that Michelle put in the chat that, you know, number 6 is really helpful for her, greeting the inner critic with humor, even if the definitions are different. And that's really great because I want to invite you all. I can't say this enough times. This is not a prescription. Please take this and run with it, make it your own. Anybody have something? And if you've come to a something major event, you know that when you come live, we turn off the record and we go to the after party. So if you want to work this through in the after party, we can do it at the after party. But if anybody wants, maybe you have a hard stop in a few minutes to chat through something. Sam. Hey, Sam.
Nice to see you. Nice to hear your voice.
So great to see you. I love this.
Yes. Nice and early on my side of the country. So thank you. Okay. So I get to work through one of these. Is that right?
Yeah. What's something where your inner critic is getting really chatty?
My inner critic gets really chatty before I do. So I have a team. I'm going on my first trip for a year. I'm going up to San Francisco with one of my really important clients, and it's important to me that I do a good job. It's a CEO and her team, and I'm putting together the deck now for a half-day team session, and I keep the chatter in my head is, you always do this. You put too much in the deck and it's too much and it's not going to be right. And you need to spend more time doing it. And I should have done this and I should have done that. And truthfully, you know, I just need to stop thinking about it and just do what I know needs to be done. But this kind of stuff comes up all the time, or I'll be working with a partner and I'll feel competitive, and, you know, I don't know. I just, you know, it comes up for me. So I guess, shall I pick one?
Well, I mean, you don't have to pick one. We can do it together,
Okay.
Right? So
Okay.
I already heard a little bit of awareness, right? Where
Yeah.
are you seeing some awareness already?
I know when it's happening. I know when it's happening because it's the recording. It's the feed. And the way I disrupt it is I'll go for a workout, and that'll work it out for a while. But then I come back to the computer and I'm like, there it is again. I'm confronted with it because things aren't working smoothly like I need them to. And it takes me a really long time to work through this type of work product. I really have to think it through, and it takes longer. And I get frustrated with myself, and I believe that I should be doing it more expeditiously.
And Sam, I want to point out, and Sam, thank you for volunteering. Sam is a friend of mine. So thank you, Sam, for being brave. You know, one of the things that, Sam, I feel like I can say this because you're my friend, right? Is I want to connect for you the dots on one thing you're doing that's not working from those 3 things that don't work, right? You're working out. It's great to take care of yourself, but it sounds to me like working out is a version of hitting the mute button. And so it's no wonder when you come back from the workout, it sneaks back up. And so I'm curious, what do you think the inner critic is trying to keep you safe from? By getting really chatty and questioning your deck and poking holes in your approach before this presentation?
It's trying to make me a perfectionist. It's trying to make me do it perfectly. And the funny thing is, I'll email the client and say, I'm doing this, and here's the next steps. And, you know, and she emailed, you know, she fully trusts me. And she's like, great, do your thing. I'll see you Friday. And I'm like, no, you have to, no, you know, and it's kind of silly because I want her to be hard on me too, because I want her to, you know.
So Sam, let me ask you this. When is a time when you had a big presentation and you rocked it? Tell me about a specific time.
Um, July last year was probably the last team session that I did, and I feel like I did a really good job. Yes.
What was great about it?
I worked really hard. I prepared for it, and it was creative. It was really creative. I pulled it together, and I kind of went out on a limb and did things that, you know, it was a very corporate client, but I did fun things that meant something. And it was creative, but the bottom line was meaningful to them, and I think they got what they needed.
And so, as you think about that experience, right, you worked hard, you trusted your intuition, you trusted your instincts, you gave yourself to be permission to be creative. You know the recipe for success. And it sounds like you didn't have half the relationship with that client that you do with this one. What is something that you can tell your inner critic to let your inner critic know that you've got this and you've got the tools?
Could you repeat that? And then I'll tell myself.
Right? What's something based on, we talked about, you were creative, you followed your intuition, you followed your instinct, you prepared that last time that you were successful. So what's something that you could tell your inner critic based on your own past experience to let your inner critic know that you've got this, you know how to prepare?
Okay. I have a saying when I coach others, because, you know, I'm an executive coach, right? So to follow my own advice and say, I will give this metaphor. I'll say, okay, when you're too far in the details of things or the construction of something, back up and look at the mural on the wall, see how it all fits together, get the big picture, and you have this. You know how the pieces fit. Don't go up to the mural when it's this far away, back up to it, and then you'll see how the pieces fit, and it flows from there.
So what does your mural look like?
Right now it's really bright and a bunch of colors everywhere that aren't well blended, but it's beautiful.
So you've got your paintbrush, you've got your mural, you've got your past evidence, and bottom line it for me. What is one thing you can tell your inner critic to tell your inner critic that you've got this?
It's going to be a beautifully creative, very original masterpiece.
Can we give Sam some claps? Because it is really brave to share with a group of strangers joining from all over the world. We had some Canadians, we had an Australian sign up for this, something so vulnerable and brave. So Sam, thank you so much. And I just want to connect the dots with what Sam and I just did. She already came with the awareness, right? She acknowledged that. So all I did was connect the dots for her. Sounds like you're already aware. I invited her to get curious. And then you probably saw what tactic, throw it in the chat. Which of these tactics did I spend most of my time working on with her? What did you hear? Jan just said it, she's on mute. Okay, so you heard, right? And we're getting multiple, right? It's a trick question because there were multiple. Jan says number 3. I helped her find ways to comfort her inner critic. I did. And somebody else said number 6. We envisioned the alternatives. And so this is how it works. I love that Nina said number 2, we did getting curious. And that's the secret about the 8 tips, by the way. You don't have to do them in a sequential order, but they're all very complementary. All very complementary. So again, just claps for Sam one more time. Sam, it is so vulnerable and brave to do that. I know that everybody took a lot out of that. And so as we come to kind of final thoughts here, I have asked you all to share a lot about yourselves tonight. And there's one thing that I want to share about me, and it's this. I have been through so many feels with my inner critic. For a long time, I thought she was the key to my success. And even though I was successful on paper for all those years that I was listening to my inner critic, I was emotionally exhausted and on edge for so much of my professional life. And as I've become, I joke, a connoisseur of my inner critic, I've actually grown to have a lot of love for her. I honestly interact with my inner critic multiple times on a daily basis. I am so aware of who she is. Getting curious has become a part of my routine because I do what I'm asking you to do, right? And it's hard work. And I really just want to say to you, your inner critic can feel very mean and you can have a lot of hatred or resentment of her. But I really have come to really appreciate mine from a place of love. And so I'll just leave you with that. We're going to open it up to Q&A in just 1 second. So if you have a question, please pop it into the chat. And while we're waiting for those to come in, I just want to talk quickly about some ways that we can keep in touch. So something major is really all about helping women live and lead their lives on purpose, right? Maximizing fulfillment and impact, minimizing self-doubt and burnout. And I hope that you'll keep in touch with me. First and foremost, Brittany's going to throw the links. We have tons of more free events coming up. So there's a fireside chat I'm doing with my friend Alicia Doherty, a former Comcast executive, on living fearlessly. We're going to be doing one on taking the woo-woo out of the mind-body connection. So please, please consider joining us for an upcoming event. I also want to encourage you, check out my website, sign up for my newsletter, so find me on social so that you can get all of the free content like this that I put out there in events and articles. Lastly is I do have a women's group leadership program that I'm running. Our cohort kicks off on Monday evening. It's a 4-month program for women who are looking to live and lead on purpose. We're going to be doing a whole session deep dive just on the inner critic. It's 4 months of group coaching and individual coaching with me. Britt's going to throw that into the chat if it's something you're interested in. Feel free to think about joining us. Like I said, we have 2 spots left. What I'm going to do, final call to screenshot this. I am going to stop my share so I can see all of your beautiful faces. We're going to take questions. For those of you who are joining on recording, this is where we are going to bid you adieu as we take questions live. So as you've been joining us on record, thanks for joining and we'll see you soon.